King James Version and other translations. Why is the King James Version of the popular translations the most inaccurate translation? Let's talk about it. Thank you for landing on my channel for the best teachings on divine health and divine healing. Click the subscribe button. Hit that old bell so you will be notified when I post new content every single week, every single Wednesday. Hi, my name is Tony Myers. I was healed of Lou Gehrig's disease. My testimony was on the 700 Club. I have written 5 books about divine healing, and I've guided thousands to be able to acknowledge their full healing. And with just a few tweaks in your perception, you, yes, you, can be next. Be blessed. Be healed. And be a blessing. The King James Version, and this is my opinion, and I'm going to explain why I have that opinion. My opinion is this, that the King James Version, because of its very nature, is more inaccurate and more open to misunderstandings than most of the modern day accepted versions. Okay? And there's reasons behind this. A lot of reasons behind this. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how do the Bible translations come about. So, first, when the biggest thing is when a translator decides, all right, I'm going to translate the Bible, then there's a decision that has to be made. Which manuscripts are you going to use? Because there are many different manuscripts. And so first you have to decide which ones are you going to use, which ones are you not going to use. That's the first thing. So, there are several different things to look for. You have to look for what part of the world did that manuscript come from? You need to look at when was it written? Because obviously something that was written closer to the time period is going to be more accurate than something written in the latter years. So that's one thing. So you've got the age, the location, where was it written? And so to do this, you've got essentially 3 different ways. Majority text, Textus Receptus, and eclectic or critical text. All right. So the majority text, which is also known as Byzantine or ecclesiastical text, it was more or less a democratic vote on which text is most accurate, which manuscript is most accurate. All right. So here's an example. If a phrase X reads X in 100 manuscripts and Y in only 50, X is considered the most acceptable translation. And the biggest problem with this is it gives absolutely no thinking about where was it written or the age of the document. Then you got Textus Receptus. It's essentially the same thing. It's very similar to the majority text. Now, this was the one used for the King James Version, and in which the Textus Receptus was compiled in the 16th century by Erasmus Rotterdamus. Now, he only had access to a few manuscripts, and they were all later. They were 12th, 13th, and 14th century. So there was a limited number of manuscripts, and he did not consider location or the time period it was written in. He didn't have all the Greek manuscripts to look at and everything else. Now, the eclectic text or critical text is what everything else uses today. That's the system in which to decide which manuscripts and everything except the King James Version and the New King James Version considers everything. It considers age, location, difficulty of the reading to determine everything. So each of these are considered into it. Location is huge because the Western and Eastern Church split at a very early period. And whereas the Eastern manuscripts took great care in preserving it, the Western did not so much. So where was it written? How old is it? Obviously, something second, third, and fourth generation is going to be more accurate than something 14th century. Now, all modern day Bibles except the King James Version and the New King James Version takes all that into account. So by its very nature, that's one reason why I make the statement that the King James Version is the least accurate. Now, with that said, that's one big point right there. The other big point, what type of translation is it? All right. And now this does vary with, you've got formal equivalence, you've got dynamic equivalence, and then you have paraphrase. Now, some of them also will put in bilinear translation. Now, there are some bilinear texts, but those are essentially the bilinear ones. They keep the Greek words in there that come close to an English word, but that type of translation, there are some written that way, but most of us English-speaking people couldn't even begin to understand it, okay, unless you've got a background in language. So that's why we're going with you've got the formal equivalence, the dynamic equivalence, and then you've got the paraphrase. Now, the formal equivalence, which, once again, with this, essentially, the King James Version is the version that has essentially formal equivalence. Formal equivalence is word by word. They took one word from the Hebrew and stuck in an English word by the same tone in Greek. So they took a Greek word and put in another one. You cannot go from one language to another language and gain an understanding of the text through a simple word for word, because then you don't have the full author's intent. And that's where things come across wrong. Then the language is very cumbersome for starters, and to comprehend it, that's the problem. Also, there's figures of speech that cannot be directly translated, and they're meaningless without explanation. That's the other problem with the formal equivalence. And once again, the King James is the one that is the closest, that is word for word. King James, New King James. Then the dynamic equivalence, or functional equivalence. That's another name for it. It considers the meaning behind the text. And so, in most of your accepted translations, most of the modern day translations are indeed dynamic equivalence. And just two of those, the NIV and the NLT. Now, then you've got the paraphrase. So you've got the word for word, which is to the extreme left, you've got the formal equivalents, which it does what it's supposed to mean. Then at the far right, you have got the paraphrase. The paraphrase is not trying to keep even within, and so it's going to the far right, and that is very subjective, and that is very, it is completely open to the translator's slant. The translator could put anything to. Now, most translations fall somewhere in between, in the middle. You've got the Message, you've got the Amplified, that fall in the middle between being an equivalence and being a paraphrase. And so you've got different, whereas the King James Version is word for word. The rest of the translations stack up somewhere in between. So, those are the differences. But that's why, by its very nature, that the King James Version is less accurate than these others. Now, I'm going to do a separate teaching on the verse I'm fixing to use, but I'm going to give you an example here. In 2 Timothy, you have got the word study in the King James Version, okay? And this is a common problem with the King James Version. Study to show thyself approved unto God. And this is the whole reason why we have to have a concordance with the King James Version, because what study means to us is completely different than what that Greek word really meant. That Greek word actually meant be diligent, be eager. Let me get it. It is actually spoudazo, to use speed, to make effort, to be prompt or earnest. Two totally different things. That's why we have such confusion. And if you read King James only, you're not getting the whole meaning. Also, with the King James, you've got 3 Greek words that all mean to ask. Now, even in Strong's Concordance, when those 3 Greek words are used, it simply is translated as the word ask. Even though there are 3 different words with a variation in meaning, and that is why we get confused. Now, no other translation uses the word study in 2 Timothy, none of the more popular ones, including the NLT. All right? I don't want to get into this because I'm going to do a separate teaching on 2 Timothy, but work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive His approval. That is more accurate than the King James Version. And you don't need a concordance to look that word up. Now, and one of my personal favorites, the Peshitta, it has strive to conduct yourself perfectly before God. You don't need a concordance to look that up. So that's the whole difference in the translations. And I'm not knocking the King James at all. I love the King James Version. I often use it when I teach. But at the same time, that takes more study, more digging in to understand, to correctly understand it. And my next teaching, like I said, is going to be on 2 Timothy. But that's why we have all this confusion, and where you're King James only, then your understanding, unless you do all the research, and unless you know the Greek, because even if you use a strong concordance, there are certain words like ask, like the word receive, that uses, the Greek has different words, whereas Strong's Concordance would just have receive and never explain the difference in the three different words that James Strong used and just put down to be given something. Well, he'll use the same one for each of those three different Greek words. So that is why the King James Version is the most inaccurate of all the other translations. So if you truly want to understand scriptures, I'm not saying don't use it. Like I said, I cut my teeth on the King James, and I still use it. Now, and especially for teaching, I use it because it's shorter, but I've already done the study. I've already got the other translations and everything else, so I already know the correct interpretation from a language viewpoint. But this is why, if you are King James only, there are so many people that think that's the only anointed book of God, and that's just not true. When you look at it, it uses, and one reason was because this was 1611. Now, we have access to all the manuscripts. Those translators do. Now, we've got the second, third, and fourth generations, which are earlier than what they had access to, Erasmus had access to. And yes, there was a team. I think last I read there was 47 translators with the King James Version, but it was Erasmus that developed this way. So, okay, here's this word, which one? And that's what happened. So, in Jesus' name, be blessed, be healed, and be a blessing.